This is the IoT for All Media Network. Hello, friends in IoT. Welcome to Let's Connect, the newest podcast in the IoT for All Media Network. I am Ken Briota, Editorial Director for IoT for All, and your host. If you enjoy this episode, please remember to like, subscribe, rate, review, and comment on all your favorite podcasting platforms. And to keep up with all the IoT insights you need, visit iotforall.com. Before we get into our episode, the IoT market will surpass $1 trillion in the next few years. Is your business ready to capitalize on this new and growing trend? Use Leverage's powerful IoT solutions development platform to efficiently create turnkey IoT products that you can white label and resell under your own brand. Help your customers increase operational efficiency, improve customer experience, or even unlock new revenue streams with IoT. To learn more, go to iotchangeseverything.com. That's iotchangeseverything.com. Now, let's connect. My guest today is Rick Hall, CEO of Aginity, and we're going to talk today about data management, analytics, and how they all intersect with basically everything that underlies the IoT. Rick, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really appreciate being here, Ken.
Pleasure's entirely mine, and as they're about to find out, my listeners. Can you tell us a little bit about you and your background, Rick, and sort of how Aginity fits into IoT and the whole spectrum?
Sure. Yeah. So I've been working in the analytics space for a long time, like 30 years, and came into it kind of from a business perspective of actually a nonprofit worried about how often their members renewed, which became analytics, and went from there to a startup working in the analytics space, and then started my own company that was called G4 Analytics, which was focused on using analytics in retail pricing and store activity. Sold that to Nielsen in 2012. Was there for 5 years, ran a global practice around analytics for retail, and then moved to be the CTO of a retail services company and watched 3 CEOs go through in a year and decided it was time to go back and do another startup. And had this really kind of interest around how business users were able to get analytics done and kind of moving it out of the world that was, kind of the core of the priesthood of the IT teams. And that got me to Aginity, which was a company in the space. And I bought that company a year ago. And here I am.
The idea of how data analysis works in the consumer space is really fascinating to me, and retail is sort of the most leading edge of that right now, I think it's fair to say, because I don't think most people realize that there's a ton of data points to look at, and all of it taken sort of in aggregate becomes really rich and powerful. Like the science around sort of shelf placement in grocery and big box is by itself a whole crazy discipline with like gamification elements and all this other stuff. There's a great documentary about it that now the name escapes me, but I am fascinated with that whole element because I think that it can turn into not just really powerful and interesting for the retailer, but also for the customer. I think that there's really a lot of potential for customers to be getting better service, lower prices, even a lot of good benefit out of just this kind of activity tracking. And I'm wondering sort of where do we sit with that now? Because it's easy to imagine the sci-fi version of it.
Sure.
Where does that sit?
Yeah, it is an interesting space, right? So when I was at Nielsen, I ran what we called the sales effectiveness practice, which was all of the analytics around how do you price a product, how's it promoted, where is it on the shelf, in the placement, what stores are you in, what other products do you put around it? It's a bunch of stuff, as you say, and all of those things are now modeled, right? So, and if you actually think about it, every item on every shelf in every store at every price point is a chance every day to succeed or fail with execution, right? So if you're a retailer, that's your problem space, is like, it's not just how many stores I have. It's not even how many products I have. It's how many products and how many stores and how many combinations, and every day, and even multiple points of a day, that you can succeed or fail at, right? And you're trying to do that and get the maximum sales, of course, out of your store, if you're a retailer, with the minimum amount of inventory, right? So, you can make sure you have all the right products in the store if you put, 10 days of supply in every store, but that would cost you a lot of money, right? So you're trying to kind of keep your inventory as thin as you possibly can while you're executing all these things very interactively, right? And so all of it's modeled. So you start with price, right? Kind of price elasticity is, if I increase the price, I'm going to sell a lot more. I mean, a lot less. If I lower the price, how much more? And so you're trying to find an optimal price. Mm-hmm. You're trying to find a promoted price. So, if it's normally $1, but I have 50 cents off, what does that mean? And then how does that impact other products on the shelf? So all of that has been built into models. That was kind of what I was doing at Nielsen, and what the company that I had built, G4, did, that we sold to Nielsen. Now,
how do you measure that? Is it just in sort of the delta of sales between changes, and what's the data you're looking for there?
Yeah, so that's a very astute question. So you start with, well, let's call it a baseline, which is this figmentary, kind of concept, is all things being equal, how many of these things will I sell in the store, right? So you start with an assumption about what you've got already, right? And then you kind of create a baseline, which is some historical average. And in that baseline, you're trying to take out all of the variables that you're modeling for, right? And then, so say promotion, right? Kind of, you don't want to consider the promotions in your baseline. And once you have a baseline, then everything is an increment against baseline, right? So if I decrease the price, how many more do I sell, right? Or if I increase the price, do I sell fewer? How many more? And it's all a delta, kind of difference, incrementality. Right. And every one of these variables, price, promotion, assortment, placement, are all measured as incrementality.
That's really, really cool. I could go down this sort of retail nuts and bolts all day, but we got to keep it moving. So I want to start us moving a little bit higher up and talk about executions against data, because I think that in the IoT anyway, data collection is pretty well understood. We do a lot of environmental sensors, we do a lot of activity tracking, we do, there's a lot of mechanism for data collection. Yeah. But I don't think folks always understand the execution against that data and what they're looking for in analysis. Yeah. One example that I like that's related to retail is a couple of years ago, there was a big move to try like augmented reality shelf things for coupons, and to me it always seemed hokey, but I just sort of put that up to the technology not being quite right. Yeah. But now that the technology is actually really good for AR, no one's doing it in retail as far as I can tell. So to me, that seems like a poor execution against a lot of good data. And I'm curious about, in the IoT world, how should folks be looking to execute against the data they're collecting? What are some of the key factors that they need to be paying attention to?
So I think in the use of data in general, I think the model that we like to think about is almost a science model. And by that, I mean, I have a hypothesis and I want to use data to validate that hypothesis, test that hypothesis, right? And so, kind of, I think a lot of early analytics is like, I'm going to come up with the answer. And I think actually the answer is a lot less important now than the question, right? The question being the hypothesis. And once you start thinking that it's the hypothesis that matters, then that immediately puts you into the mindset of how can I test that hypothesis as quickly as possible? and then figure out, do I have the hypothesis right? Is it, or do I need to change it and test, kind of other ideas, right? So I think just analytics, think use of data, think hypothesis, think validation. That's the first part of it for me.
That makes sense. I think that if the survey data collection folks have known this forever. If you don't ask the right questions, you're not going to get the right data. And in IoT, I think we maybe sometimes forget that, because so much of the data collection process is automated, or it's environmental, or it's sort of constant data, and we're only looking for change in a state or whatever. But if you're not looking for the right change, if you aren't sure what the failure state looks like yet, those questions really, really matter. This is another sort of execution against data question, but how do you feel about the value of sort of virtual environment for testing, for measurement, for experimentation against hypothesis, that kind of thing? The digital twin idea.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of interesting executions in small scale. I haven't seen a lot of sort of systematic builds of this kind of space, but I don't think they're far away.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure, to be honest with you, of how important that's going to play as a role. I think the digital twin is really useful in a case where you can't test in the real world, right? So, if the reason if you start your approach to analytics with the hypothesis, the question, and your follow-up question to that is, how do I test that as quickly as possible? And the environment you're in makes it such that testing in the real world is too difficult, too time-consuming. Now you've got a real case for the digital twin, right? And whereas sometimes, concepts like the digital twin, which is a really cool, interesting idea, like people get so interested in the idea of the twin that they didn't necessarily think about why they were putting the twin there in the first place, right? It's like, oh, the twin is the idea. No. The idea is the problem you're trying to solve. And the twin becomes a mechanism to do that. So I think if it's put in that context, I think digital twins can be really useful. Like we did a project with a customer who's in the shipping industry, kind of testing ship conditions. Well, that's really hard. The ships have to sail off to sea, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So the digital twin became a really useful way for them to accelerate their ability to test conditions.
Yeah, I think we can think of 100 examples of how useful that would be. Like, here's just a crazy hypothetical. What if a ship turned sideways in a major canal? What would you do then?
Sue the pants off them, apparently, is the answer, right?
Well, I think we all knew that was going to happen. That's the most likely outcome the minute that situation began. Yeah. Somebody getting sued.
Yes.
All right. So we're talking about a lot of sort of execution pieces. Let's dig into some of the real nerdery here about analytics. One of the things that I find really fascinating is sort of that next step up above the direct analytics into and I may have been using this term wrong all my life, the metadata, where you look at sort of the outcomes of sort of ostensibly unrelated data sets, and you try to look for correlations and try to find unexpected outcomes. That's sort of the part of it that I find really fascinating.
Yeah.
So please tell me that that's not super useful, if that's true, and that I should stop worrying about that kind of weirdness.
No, I think it's
interesting.
Yeah. First of all, metadata in general is a huge, problem and topic, right? So, I'll kind of take a circuitous route back to your question, but, one of the things that we work on is this idea that people in the business can be empowered to use data and do analytics themselves, right? So used to be you had to wait for some central team Now you want people to be able to do it themselves, right? Well, when people start doing it themselves, you really need a real clear way to govern that and have some metadata around it, so you don't end up with like a million points of chaos, right, and variation. So metadata is useful in that circumstance, right? A related place, which I think gets more close to your question, is kind of in, and I'll say modeling. I know you're going to, you have a kind of an AI, bent that you have a discussion about, right? But for me, modeling just means some set of kind of higher order math to look at a problem, right? So, kind of correlation analysis, simple type of model. But, increasingly, what we find is people are wanting to say, I want to apply lots of models, like maybe 1,000 different models, to see which one is better. And so that becomes a meta-analysis of the results of many models that help you find an answer. And I think that's another of many places where metadata matters.
Since you opened the door to talk a little bit about AI, I think that's all that current AI really is a higher order mathematical analysis. I think there's certainly an argument to be made that AI is right now functionally only good statistics and automated good statistics to some extent. Yeah. How much of this sort of process do you feel like should be automated? Or is there a reason to not have just results come out at the end with the assumption that you've asked the right questions? Let it run through the algorithm, the AI, the statistical analysis, and then just get result at the end that says you should tune your manufacturing rig, 3 degrees to the left so that it doesn't vibrate in this way anymore, kind of thing.
Well, it's the robot answer bit, which is, I think, the part that, kind of creates all kinds of social discussion, right? Is I actually think it's in many ways less useful than, the analysis as a tool to feed humans, right? So I'm in the world, and I will use AI, but let's just say advanced math. Sure. Is useful to empower people. But I think a lot of times it's really the people who are going to be making the decisions, not the algorithms, right? So I think that the output where it says just do this is less often the case. And more often the case is I've got a set of different things that point a direction that, I'm going to, make some decision about. But I think, we use AI as a term to just mean higher order math. I'm with you on that. A lot of times it's, regression analysis, right, which has been around forever. It's funny because when I was at Nielsen, I inherited a team that was a bunch of statisticians, right? And they were guys, kind of my age, so old guys. And they all came up as statistics people, right? And somewhere in the middle of my time there, they got rebranded as data scientists, right? And it's like, okay, they're still doing the same stuff, right? They were starting to use more ML on top of the statistics, but which is again a different set of algorithms. It's not, kind of this deep learning thing where like I'm just going to throw a data set at something and it's going to come back and tell me what to do. That's so rare as a really useful way to do it. Most of the time we're applying models. There's multiple different types of models. Those are just calculations. And the calculations just tell you, kind of something about variation, right?
Right. It's funny. My listeners will have already learned that the side conversation is the main conversation on this show. So welcome. I always sort of laugh when you hear like Elon Musk is super worried about AI or whatever. I'm like, look, I've met a lot of computer engineers, coders, data science folks. I'm pretty sure that all of them are pretty familiar with sci-fi, and none of them are going to create a sentient AI. Leaving that aside, even if they did, all of them are just going to program it so that the answer is always 42 every time anybody asks it a
There
question.
you go. Yeah.
So, like, I'm not worried about this at all.
It's the ultimate answer of everything in the universe, right?
That's right. That's right. If you don't get that reference, I don't know. Send me a tweet and I'll tell you where to go read about it. But I also don't think that actual sentient AI is possible, but that's a whole nother philosophical discussion.
I don't know. I'm not smart enough to know whether it's possible. I would say that that's not the stuff that's going on now, right?
No. And it's not what we're trying to do either, as far as I understand. Not really. So as we start to get near the end of our time, I want to sort of give you the floor, Rick, and sort of we've talked about a lot here. We've covered a lot of ground really fast. That's what we do. But I'd like to give you a chance to sort of leave the listeners with a final thought. As they're sort of thinking about their own analysis and data management, where should they be focusing their attention? What should they be thinking of? They're thinking about to get the best possible outcomes.
Yeah, so I think there are two kind of things that are really important to me. First, I think I mentioned at the beginning, which is I think really critical, which is that all analytics is using data to drive an outcome, and start with the outcome, and form a hypothesis about how you can drive that outcome, and then use data to help you test the hypothesis. To me, like that's how you go about analytics. That's kind of the first thing. The other thing I would say, which is a really interesting side thing, is that it used to be this was something done by the priesthood. You had some group of analytic people in your organization or data scientists, and they did it, and you waited for the answer. It's like I would say in every organization, every user, it should be about empowerment, and so I think data literacy. For everybody is really important. Like I actually think we should be teaching data literacy in our schools. I think that should be a program now. That's kind of perhaps a crazy thought. I think we all need to use data. We can all use data. I think the basics of it is just what we said.
Yeah, and I think that. I think that you're exactly right. And my kids are fairly young. They're in 4th and 5th grade, and I'm looking forward to hearing that they're doing stats here any day now. Hopefully, because I know it was later than I wish it was, and I was a little bit ahead in math. So. For me, so if they get to high school without looking at any statistics, it's going to be a shame.
But here's something that just to slide to that point, right? I was on the phone with my brother and his daughter, right? And she's in high school, and she's not really a math and science person, but she's taken a stats class, and she was telling me how cool it was. And I thought, wow, when I was in school, everybody thought statistics was the most boring thing in the world. Unless you were a math nerd, you were not into it. But data has affected, I think, that generation so much more than the rest of us that, it was really cool to hear somebody who really is a humanities person seeing how data was relevant to them. And it just made me smile.
That's really cool. It's probably also a function of the fact that the ones coming up are definitely smarter than us than came before. So that's good news for all of us too. I really want to thank you, Rick, for joining me today. This was a really great conversation and a lot of fun. Thanks again to all of you listening out there. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion, and if you have, please make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our episodes. We post every week, and I hope you'll leave us a rating, review, and comment on your favorite podcasting platform. If you'd like to suggest a guest, please click on the link in the description. And we also have a great sister podcast on our network called the IoT for All podcast, so make sure you check that out.
Hey Ken, let me jump in real quick and introduce your audience to another awesome show on the IoT for All Media Network, the show that started it all, the IoT for All podcast, where I bring on experts from around the world to showcase successful digital transformation across industries. We talk about use cases and IoT solutions available in the market and provide an opportunity for those companies to share advice to help the world better understand and adopt IoT. So if you're out there listening and haven't checked it out, be sure to go check out the IoT for All podcast, available everywhere.
Thank you, Ryan. Now get back to your show. And thank you all for joining us on this episode of Let's Connect. I've been Ken Briota, editorial director of IoT for All, and your host. Our music is Sneaking on September by Otis McDonald. And this has been a production of the IoT for All Media Network. Take care of yourselves. You are listening to the IoT for All Media Network.